I mean, florists, I ended up doing the flowers myself because florists were wanting to charge me upwards of $2,000 for a few, and I had dried flowers, right? So it's like, you want $2,000 for dried flowers? Like, okay, all the financial stuff.
All the financial stuff.
I think that's probably the biggest, I don't know, stress factor, do you think?
I think it's the biggest impediment for a lot of people, yes.
Yeah, like when they're thinking about it outside of, like before they decide on doing it, it's either like an either or situation. So I think that probably having the opportunity to do both in the same year is a lot.
Yeah.
But I think the financial stress is probably the biggest aspect, and it's kind of what makes the decision on whether or not they can do it. Okay, so I think, well, let's back up and talk about how we got in here. So how we got it, not in here, like in the house.
So let's talk about how we got to this point.
Yeah, let's talk about how we got to this point. So I became a real estate agent in 2020. 2020? Yeah, same year I met you. And then we got engaged in 2021. But before I was in real estate, I was kind of working in the catering and event planning space. So I already at that point in time had done that for many, many years, well before I met you. So I was well aware of what things cost. I think that was kind of a big thing a big aspect, because I was in both industries, a big aspect that, you know, we got to know. And I think that for me is like, when I sat down with you and we knew that we were going to get married, because I think we decided on getting married before we decided to get a house, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we always knew that the house was going to come with it. What kind of house, how much money it would cost, et cetera, et cetera. That was always kind of more of an open question.
Yeah. I mean, because I knew a house was going to come mostly because obviously I lived in my old place and I had roommates, and you lived in that condo, and that condo was super tiny. Like,
it was not big enough.
It was not big enough. I mean, now that we're in this house and both of our stuff is here, there's absolutely no way that we could have lived together in that condo. It would have been a lot of downsizing by you.
Yeah, I walk downstairs and I go, oh, all this is still here.
Right? Like, oh, we still haven't even unpacked 10 months later? Yeah. Anyway. Oh my gosh, we're in the last part of the year.
Yeah.
Anyway. But yeah, so I think that having a budget and sticking to it was a big one to help with that. And I mean, like, really sticking to it. So I think you got to see one Excel spreadsheet budget, and that's the one that we had in our shared folder. And I think I had like 4 or 5 before then to kind of give me an idea. But having that, like, I was very strict on my budget. That's not true, actually. Remember, our budget was $1,000 less when we first started, and then I increased it by $1,000 because I couldn't. You know what it was? It was the tables.
You're talking about the wedding budget, yes.
Yeah, the wedding budget. It was the tables. I knew that I had to have my tables. The funny thing is those ended up being way cheaper than I thought they were going to be because we didn't use all of the tables. We kind of did mix match.
Let's talk about the wedding budget. I mean, I think as you said earlier, it helped that you understood how much things cost, because I, of course, had no idea.
Oh no.
And then you knew also how to, I think, get savings where, again, I would have had no idea.
Yeah. Well, it does help that. Well, one, I'm kind of cheap. I don't know if I want to say cheap, but I was budget conscious, and I was very, very budget conscious. The budget was always in the back of my mind, as you will remember. I was always talking about like, I don't know if I can afford that. And so I think a big part of that, for the wedding at least, was I started off the wedding and I had a hierarchy of needs. And I mean, when I was a wedding planner, I used to tell people that. Like, you really, if you want to stay within budget and be budget conscious, then you need to be like, the most important part of my wedding is X, or the top 3. And I wrote it out, and my top 3 most important things were the catering, the videography, and the photography. Those 2 of those 3 things were the first things that we actually scheduled and booked. And they also took, the 3 of those probably took up, I'm going to say 3/4 of the budget. Maybe not quite. 5/8. We're going to do all of the fractions.
I mean,
now.
The percent, it was the majority.
It was a large majority. But because I knew that those were the most important things to me, when we were looking at other aspects like maybe the design and stuff like that, I really had to think hard about how can I have this beautiful looking wedding, but like cut back in areas that maybe didn't matter to me as much because they weren't one of the big three. And this is one of the reasons why, I went to Goodwill for like silverware, right? Because I was like, okay, great, I can get all our wedding silverware for $20, or I think it was a little bit more than $20, but not by much. And things like that where I was like very, very adamant about being like, this is something that I want to make sure that we have money for the big things.
Something that I think is critical for couples to talk about and have a conversation about is whether or not it's right for you to have a wedding at all. There was one I remember one very memorable conversation you and I had about it, where I finally pulled you aside because I thought you were being very stressed out about it, and I said, does it make sense for us to do this, to have this wedding? We can just as easily go down to the courthouse, have the judge marry us, and go out for a nice dinner afterwards, and it's probably going to cost us maybe a few $1,000s.
Yeah.
And we have our relatives in town, the very close ones who we knew we wanted, as opposed to 70 or 80 people. We ended up deciding to go forward with the wedding because I knew that it was something that she had always wanted, and it was something that Marcy had dreamed about since a very early age, and I wanted to make sure that she had that. I didn't want her to regret not having it.
Which is nice.
Well, and I mean, it's nice, but I think that's also a very useful frame in which to talk about it, in which to think about it amongst yourselves. Is this, if you don't do this, is it something that you're going to regret forever?
Yeah.
And I thought it was.
I think another thing that people always forget about is the fact that it is a wedding day, and I know especially a lot of women, we get this idea that like it has to be so amazing and it's going to be like a princess wedding and everything like that. Guess what? The reality is a lot of us are princesses. And so I think we forget that the marriage is so much more than the wedding day. And so then even I think I fell victim to this a couple of times where I was so stressed out about the wedding day, and I didn't need to be by any means. I think it helps when you have this idea of like, okay, this is going to be a fun day to celebrate this marriage, but it is not my marriage. Where I think that in terms of the house, then I think that is it's a purchase that has more effect on the entirety of your relationship, significantly more than the wedding. And I think you need to really think about that and keep that in mind because, the wedding is great and it's fun. It's one day, whereas the house, and this is why they're much more expensive, the house could be, in some people's lives, it could be their forever home. Very unusual for your first home right after you get married to be your forever home. But I think that, 10, 15, maybe even 20-year investment, that's a long time, right? You're not having a wedding every 20 years. It was one day 20 years ago, whereas you're living every single day in a house.
The other critical aspect of the wedding, too, is that on that day, you'll find very quickly that it's not about you. It's a celebration, but it's a celebration of your lives together, but it's for the other people who are there. It's for your guests. Mm-hmm. It's not for you. For me, I actually recall being a little bit frustrated about it because there were people there some of whom I hadn't seen for years and years, and I barely got to spend any time with them at all. But that is the reality of it. That the day is so scheduled, and there are so many people to say hello to, that very few of them you're going to have the time to engage with for very long.
Yeah, I think being realistic about budgets, both in terms of planning your wedding as well as buying a house, is so important. Shopping around, both in houses and in a wedding. We talked to how many caterers? Probably 15, 20 caterers. Florists. I ended up doing the flowers myself because florists were wanting to charge me upwards of $2,000 for a few, and I had dried flowers, right? So it's like, you want $2,000 for dried flowers, like. So I think shopping around until you find someone that you think that you can trust, but also that fits within your budget is really, really, really important. I think wedding planners is actually where I shopped around with quite a bit as well.
Mhm.
I met with some amazing wedding planners. Actually, wedding planners that I had worked with previously when I was in the industry, and good friends of mine. And I would never ask a friend to discount anything for me. And so when they told me their prices, I was just like, oh, I can't afford it. If that's one of your must-haves, go for it. It was not a must-have for me. It was not like one of the big three items that I had to have. But I think shopping around is really important to kind of make sure that things fit within your budget. The same thing kind of goes in houses, right? Like when I sell people a house, I always tell them there's going to be another house. There will be another house. You fall in love with the house, and I totally get that. And then if you don't win it, which when we bought our house, that happened to us. 2020, 2021 was a crazy time.
A few times.
We bought it this year, I guess, technically, but
Yeah.
the past 2 years have been crazy. But just realizing that like there's other houses that can fit your budget. It might take time, definitely. Don't get me wrong, but something is out there that fits your budgetary needs, which I think is just a really, really important to remember. I'll kind of let you take the lead on the second one here. Like, I think one of the big helping factors that we had was just the fact that you had a lot of equity.
Yeah, so this is a critical point, which is that the first house that you purchase, whether that's by yourself or as a couple or whatever the case may be, it's probably not going to be your forever home. You shouldn't think of it as such. So, just to put my own personal gloss on it, before I was married, before I met Marcy, I bought a townhouse outside the city, and I didn't love it. It was okay. It had a few problems, but mostly it was a pretty solid place to live for a couple of years. And when I sold it, I was happy to sell it, and not only because I didn't really like it, which is true, but also because I pulled a ton of positive equity out of it to the point where I got paid to live there. And this is one of the critical points that I think people forget about buying a home and owning a home, which is that the money you put into it, you will almost always get back out of it in some fashion or another to some degree. As this is opposed to renting, where you're basically sending that money to your landlord every month and you will never see it again. So having that equity and being able to fold that into your next down payment, it's critical. And you shouldn't think of the first home you buy as something that you're going to have to own forever, because you probably won't. And it's quite probable that actually by not owning it forever, you will be able to purchase your next property.
Yeah. I think I always tell my clients that equity is the big monetary factor that isn't seen, but actually it plays a huge role in purchasing a home. And I think anybody, especially first-time home buyers, they forget about equity, or they just don't know about what equity is, because it is, you might have paid $100,000. That's definitely not Seattle numbers, but for math reasons, we'll go with $100,000. And so in your head, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm out 100 grand. That's a ton of money, and you're paying for it every single month. You're paying for it every single month. And then when you get around to selling it in 10 to 15 years with appreciation, because houses do appreciate, even if there's a downturn to the market, even in recessions, houses are one of the few assets that always appreciate. And so with that appreciation, okay, yes, you spent $100,000, but you could potentially turn it around for $300,000 or $500,000 or $800,000. I mean, there are houses that I know we looked at, as well as some of my clients have looked at, where the person who was selling the house had owned it since the late 70s. They had built it with their own hands for practically what we think of as no money, and they owned it outright, and they're now selling it in today's market, and so they're getting an insane amount of equity in it. And that's that number that you really don't get to see, really don't get to fully experience until you move on to your next property and you sell the house. But it is also the aspect that is a huge factor in building wealth and generational wealth, because it's something that you can pass down. if you're downsizing or if you're moving. Let's say if you go from a very densely populated, very expensive area, like let's say San Francisco, people who move from San Francisco, the real estate there is much more expensive. And for them to sell there and get the equity there, but then move up, maybe here where, if they're in Everett or Tacoma or something like that, where it's way cheaper, they're getting a lot more money. And they might even be able to find a comparable house or a larger house for less than what they have paid. And then they have this additional wealth in the bank where they can invest or do other things with their money. So that equity is so important.
One last critical point I want to make about taking equity from the sale of the home is that if you live in that house for at least 2 years as your primary residence, that equity is tax free. The federal government does not touch it. The state government, there's usually like excise taxes, but they're pretty negligible, maybe like 0.5%. So you get to take all of that money and keep it as your nest egg or roll it into the purchase of your next home. And there are very few things, very few other sources of income in the U.S. where you can say that for.
I think the other big one that on the financial aspect of both buying a home, marriage and mortgage, buying a home and getting married within the same year, is just having open conversations, which I think we have done a very good job with the entire time of our relationship. But having that kind of, I think financial conversations might be one of the hardest conversations to have with your partner because it is so vulnerable. I know you hate that word, but it is. And it's a hard question to have, especially hard because even in our relationship where I came to the table with more debt, especially with more student debt than you, it was one of those things where we had to talk about that and what that looked like. But I think it's so important to have these conversations with your partner. Talk about